Awesome.
5:31. I'm not really, we can wait another minute maybe to see. We had over 60 people register, so maybe they'll just trickle in. Eventbrite's, oh, we'll see. Okay, so yeah, but we can just start introducing ourselves and then have you hop right into explaining the propositions maybe. Oh, and you're, so hi, my name is Stasha Wodurinsky. This is the ballot measure events for the 2020 California propositions. Thanks so much for joining. It seems like more people are coming on. We'll just, should we give a few more minutes, or what do you think, Daniel?
Yeah. Yeah, we can maybe 3:35. Give
Okay,
them
yeah,
three.
that's a good plan. Yeah, a
Yeah,
lot of
it's
people are
three.
hopping on right now, so might as well.
Awesome.
It's Berkeley time, right?
Yeah, I know we didn't indicate it, but probably it's probably everyone's going by Berkeley time. You're right. Thanks everyone for joining. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to just log on. So if you have joined, feel free to grab a drink and relax for a second, and we'll start in about 2 more minutes, maybe a minute.
We'll start soon, y'all. Thank you for being patient. Oh, here, to those who are in the Zoom call, I could share the link to the YouTube stream. So if you want to invite your friends and family to get informed on these two, you're more than welcome to share this link. Okay. Here. How do I? Oh no, wait, I can't chat. Huh? Okay, wait.
Great, we'll give 1 more minute. And then as far as for people, it might be easiest when we get going to just change your view from gallery to speaker view, just as a Zoom thought on that. But great. It is 5:35. We'll just get started and see how the night continues. And we have a lot of propositions to get through and a lot of good information to learn. So we will just hop right in. I'll do a little bit of introductions before Ben gets into the proposition. So my name is Stasha Wodurinsky. I am a member of the Student Collaborative on Impact Leadership, which is helping to host, as well as CPHPL and the Advocacy Initiative, all of this Berkeley School of Public Health. Do you want to introduce?
Hey everybody, so my name is Daniel. I'm also a part of the CPHPL team, and I'm here hosting with Stasia on the California ballot. And we're happy to have Ben Christopher with us, representative from Cal Matters, here to inform us on the 2028 California propositions. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit, Ben?
Sure. Yeah, so my name's Ben Christopher. I'm an election reporter with Cal Matters. Cal Matters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet. We're based in Sacramento, although I happen to live in Berkeley. And my life over the last few months has been just trying to learn as much as possible about everything on the California ballot, especially these 12 propositions, which, as if you've looked at your ballot yet, you can tell are quite complicated. So I'm hoping to be able to help you out as we go along. Also, just a shameless plug, calmatters.org, we do have a election guide where you can watch 1-minute videos of each of the propositions. So if you're looking for something a little bit pithier and better looking than me in my closet, I encourage you to check those out, and also lots of other information about the propositions and everything else on the ballot. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. And then Daniel, do you want to go over just logistics of how we're going to run for the next 90 minutes-ish?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so we'll be going over all the 12 propositions. We'll allow about 4 minutes for each one. Or Ben, just tell us how much time you might need for each prop. Hopefully, we have at least 2 minutes per question. 2 minutes of questions after each proposition is mentioned. And if you have a question, just feel free to raise your hand on the Zoom, on the raise hand function on participants. Or yeah, you should be able to raise your hand there, and then from there, we'll go ahead and unmute the people who raise their hand after the 4 minutes of informing the proposition is done. Cool.
Great. So without further ado, we can start on the first prop. So we'll be going like Proposition 14 through the final one. So Proposition 14, stem cell research.
Yeah, starting at the
Give
top.
us a little background on that and how it came to be on the ballot.
Sure, yeah. And if anyone is following from home and has their ballot in front of them, feel free to read along.
Definitely.
So starting at the top, Proposition 14. So the basic question here is whether you want the state to borrow money to fund stem cell research. So the backstory here is that in 2004, voters passed a ballot measure to set up what is called the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and to fund it with a $3 billion bond, basically borrowing $3 billion to fund this institute, which the whole purpose of the institute is to channel state money towards stem cell research. And so it was introduced at a time, it's kind of a specific context where the federal government, then under George W. Bush, had placed a ban on federal funding for embryonic stem cell research for religious reasons. And so the argument at the time was, California's a big state, we can stand up and kind of provide this money for basic research if the federal government isn't going to. So 16 years later, it's back on the ballot because that $3 billion is almost all gone. So Prop 14 would be a $5.5 billion reinvestment, or sort of a re-up to make sure that the state is still funding stem cell research into the future. So there are also some changes to the way that the institute is run embedded in this proposition. So how grant money is distributed, it would kind of more closely specify exactly which types of research should get how much money, and how, and sort of broadly, it would take some of that decision-making power away from the board, which now sort of has free reign to decide how the money is spent. But broadly, it's just a question of whether you want this to be something that the state continues to fund. And so you have a pretty broad array of support: California Democratic Party, the Governor Newsom, UC Board of Regents, and also a lot of researchers and foundations who are involved in research into various diseases like cancers and Parkinson's disease. And they say that, California should just continue to play this big role. We've been playing this big role for 16 years. We've created a lot of sort of networking between UC research labs and some of these pharmaceutical research organizations. It's provided a lot of biotech jobs, and the potential upside of these kinds of research initiatives are obviously quite large. The opposition kind of comes in two shades, I guess. The California Republican Party is opposed. Their argument is pretty straightforward. They don't want the state to be borrowing more money. Then you also have opposition from a group like the Los Angeles Times editorial board, which is generally not considered a conservative organization, but they make a slightly more sort of nuanced argument, which is that this, stem cell research is good. It's a good thing, but the institute doesn't really have any independent oversight. In the sense it's the legislature of the governor. It's completely independent of the legislature of the governor, so they can't really. It's just the board that oversees activity there, and a bunch of the board members have ties to biotech firms or health advocacy groups who sort of benefit either directly or indirectly from the institute's spending. And then in addition to that, the federal government actually no longer bans federal funding for this kind of research. President Obama repealed the George W. Bush ban in 2009. And so opponents will also argue that maybe it's not as necessary as it used to be. So that is Prop 14. Any questions on that one?
Yeah, and, if anyone has any questions, just feel free to raise your hand. Or let me see if there's any questions.
If not, we can just keep going.
Sounds good. Yeah. No questions here.
All right.
From my end. Ben, is it okay if we record, by the way, for folks who?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, perfect.
Sure.
Gonna go ahead and do that.
All right.
Awesome. Yeah. So next proposition.
Okay, so now we're getting to the juicy one, or one of the juicy ones. This is Proposition 15. This is among one of the more controversial things in the ballot, which is saying a lot because there's a lot of controversial stuff on the ballot. And it's definitely one of the more complicated ones. But the main question here is, do you want to raise business property taxes on large and maybe some medium-sized businesses in order to raise billions of dollars for local governments and for schools? So to understand how Prop 15 works, you kind of have to go back and understand another really high profile and controversial ballot measure, which was Prop 13 from 1978. And if the more you focus on California politics and policy issues, the more that you will kind of notice that everything kind of comes back to Prop 13. It's just kind of, it really fundamentally changed how California runs. And one of the main things that it did was it capped property taxes across the state. So one of the main ways it did that was by setting property taxes based on how much someone pays for a property rather than its current market value, which is unusual. Most states just say, if your property value doubles, then your property tax payment or assessment is also going to double. But in California, thanks to Prop 13, if you own a property and it doubles in value, the property taxes that you pay are still going to be fixed to that initial value that you paid for back in whenever you purchased the property. It allows for some increase in inflation. But basically, what that means is that the longer that someone owns a piece of property, assuming that property prices continue to go up and up, which in California they generally do, the bigger the tax break that you get. And it's a tax break that applies both to homeowners and to commercial and industrial property. And so what Prop 15 would do is to take away the tax break from the business side. So it wouldn't affect homeowners. It doesn't really have anything to do with homeowner properties, but it would basically split commercial property and residential property onto different tax rolls, which is why sometimes you'll hear Prop 15 called split roll. So if you ever hear split roll, that's what they're referring to. Basically how this would work is, if you own a store, for example, right now you pay your property tax based on however much the store was purchased for, or however much you purchased the store for. If Prop 15 passes, the store would be reassessed to the new market value, which would probably be higher, and so that could be potentially a very large increase in your property tax bill. And doing this across the state would raise anywhere between $6.5 to $11.5 billion. That's according to the estimate from the Legislative Analyst Office, which is sort of the nonpartisan fiscal analyst for the state. And just to put that in perspective, California's last budget was $200 billion. So another $10 billion is quite a lot of money, even in a state like California. And 60% of the new money would go to cities and counties, and 40% would go to schools or school districts. So there are some exceptions in terms of who would be hit with a new potential tax increase. So there's a small business exception, which the proposition defines as any property owner that owns less than $3 million of property in California. So depending on whether you're a property owner in Beverly Hills versus Fresno, that could mean very different things. But the yes side includes the California Teachers Association, which is the big teachers union, because obviously schools are going to get a lot more money. California Democratic Party, Governor Newsom, Joe Biden has come out for it. And they say, right now our property tax system sort of disproportionately benefits the state's largest businesses. It actually kind of tilts the playing field towards older businesses that have been sitting on those property values for a very long time and sort of collecting this ever increasing property tax break. So it's not fair. And especially now that we're in this giant recession, it would be nice to have more funding for schools and governments. Obviously, large businesses are not particularly enthusiastic about that argument. And they argue just the opposite, that we're in the middle of a recession. It'd be a really bad time to raise taxes on businesses. And so you hear that from the Chamber of Commerce, a bunch of retailers, the Retailers Association, and that kind of thing. And then you also kind of hear a similar argument from small businesses who are tenants, and they'll say, well, okay, maybe the Prop 15 is directed at the big businesses, but I rent from a big landlord, and won't they just pass the cost on to me? So those are the kind of the two arguments that you hear from the no side. Any questions on Prop 15? It's a lot, so I'll stop there and take any questions if you have any.
Yeah, any questions? Oh, cool. Yeah, I got one here. From Jack Chapel. Go for it.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how this works. Is there anything about the timing of like implementation? I mean, is there anything written in the ballot for that, or is that just something that'll be decided later?
No, yeah, that's a good question. So it would be implemented in 2023, although if you are there's a rule where if you are part of like say a strip mall or something, and over 50% of the tenants within that strip mall are considered small businesses, then you get sort of a more gradual phase into 2025. There's also just sort of like there's been some chatter from the assessors of California, the powerful lobby of the assessors, the people who would actually be entrusted to sort of do all these reassessments, and they're saying like, we do not have the person power to deal with this. So in practice, it might actually be there might be some delays on that end, or it might require more state or county funding to deal with that. But at least now, according to the proposition, we're talking about 2023 to 2025.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions, so I think feel free to jump to Prop 16.
Okay, Prop 16. So this would repeal a ban on affirmative action programs for public entities in California. So if Prop 16 passes, it would allow public universities and colleges to take things like race and ethnicity and gender into account when they're making admissions decisions. And that's sort of, when you hear Prop 16 discussed, it's often in the context of higher ed, but it would also apply to public hiring decisions. So if a state or a public school district or a local government is trying to hire someone, they could also take these kinds of things into account, or when they're awarding contracts. So the history here, and again, this is kind of like a trend of all these propositions and propositions in general, that there's constantly revising prior propositions. But the history here is that in 1996, California voters passed a proposition to ban affirmative action in California. It's worth pointing out, I think, that even if Prop 16 passes and affirmative action is once again allowed, it wouldn't be mandatory. Public agencies could make the determination on their own how they want to do it. And also, quotas of any kind are illegal across the country. The Supreme Court has said that numerous times. So for example, a university, if Prop 16 passes, a university might be able to say, okay, we have this candidate pool, and this group comes from a historically disadvantaged racial or ethnic group. And so we're going to take that into account as part of the overall sort of holistic view of their application. What they couldn't say is, okay, next year we want 15% of our student body to be X. So it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But politically, this is actually kind of an interesting one, because it's really one that has cut through the Democratic Party in particular. So some Democrats in the legislature have been trying to get a measure like this one on the ballot for decades, and they've always failed, despite Democratic control of the California legislature for some time. Not just because Republicans oppose it, but because opposition from their own party, even among fairly liberal or progressive members of the caucus. This year, I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing it on the ballot, because it was proposed through the legislature to put it on the ballot, and it kind of hit the major committees at just around the time of George Floyd's killing. And so I think there were a lot of lawmakers who wanted to be on the record showing that they recognized the need to sort of address institutional racism in some kind. And so there was sort of a political momentum to get this off on the ballot. And you really see, in terms of the funding and the endorsements that we see for this measure, that that's really carried through, although public opinion is still pretty slanted against it, at least according to most recent polls. So it's very lopsided in that respect. But on the yes side, the campaign has raised something like 15 times more than the no side, and endorsements are like Governor Newsom, University of California, the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, Dianne Feinstein, a bunch of large labor unions, a bunch of large business groups. So sort of like all the big names are on one side. And, you know, the argument that you hear from them is that we're never going to get to racial or ethnic equality within the sort of a merit-based system, because merit-based systems reward people who have had access to things like, you know, very good elementary schools and access to credit and tutoring and SAT prep and violin classes and all that kind of thing. And so the only way to address those racial inequities is to address the racial inequities directly. The no side is a combination of, actually among the opponents, the most vocal and sort of sizable have been Asian American civil rights groups, particularly Chinese American civil rights groups, and also sort of traditional conservative and Republican activists and national anti-affirmative action groups. And they argue that it's just inherently unfair to judge someone based on their race or ethnicity or gender or anything like that. So that is Prop 16.
Any questions? Feel free to put your hand up or some sort of reaction, so I know. Okay, I think that one was straightforward for people. Okay, we go to the next one.
All right, 17 and 18 are actually kind of related, and they're both pretty straightforward, so I'll try and go through them quickly. Prop 17 is whether you want to let people who are on parole have the right to vote. So in California, unlike some states, people who have committed felonies are allowed to vote once they are, have served their time and served their debt to society, so to speak. But it's only once they are no longer on parole. So that means there are something like 40 to 50,000 Californians who are not in prison, but unable to cast a ballot because they are on parole, or likewise run for office. And this would apply to both. So Prop 17 would allow someone who's on parole to either vote or run for office. And again, the argument is, parole is actually shouldn't be thought of as punishment. It's sort of a system that's supposed to encourage people to reintegrate into society after being spending time in prison. And so giving people like the right to vote is just one way of encouraging that. And there's also sort of a disparity in the law that proponents will point out to, which is that people who are currently on probation, which actually is a punishment in the sense that it's sort of, you get probation in lieu of jail time, they can vote. So there's sort of an inconsistent standard there. Very long list of supporters: Democratic Party, Governor Newsom, League of Women Voters, most of the state's newspapers, honestly, their editorial boards. And then the opposition comes from the state GOP and some crime victims advocacy groups and conservative, like anti-voter fraud groups. But there really hasn't been much of a campaign on the no side in terms of money spent. So that's Prop 17. Vote yes if you want to give parolees the right to vote, and vote no if you don't. Should just keep moving on. Keep on keeping on.
Any questions? You all? Any questions? Okay, yeah.
Okay. Prop 18 is also a voting rights proposition. The question is whether 17-year-olds should be able to vote. It's kind of a special case. It's not all 17-year-olds. But if Prop 18 passes, I wish it was Prop 17 because that'd be a lot easier for me to remember this. But if Prop 18 passes, 17-year-olds would be able to vote in a primary or a special election if they were going to turn 18 by the general election. So again, it's kind of like a special case, but it's the argument is if someone is going to be able to vote or participate in an election in November, you might as well give them the opportunity to participate in the preceding election that determines who's going to be in the election in November. Also, there's sort of the more general argument that you want to foster the habit of voting early, and giving some 17-year-olds the opportunity to do that would be a good way to do that. So again, like Prop 17, the support is very lopsided. You have the governor, the Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, the Democratic Party, lots of the ACLU, lots of nonprofits, university student groups, and opposition is from the California GOP and some conservative activist groups, but again, not much of an institutional campaign against Prop 18. I think that one's fairly straightforward. Are there any questions that people have, or anything that I didn't speak to?
Yeah, there's one question. 1 second.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. And so this is for, they can vote in primaries for federal and state elections?
That's right.
Okay. And then I was also just wondering, I mean, do you know, in terms of other states, are there other states that have anything kind of similar, allowing younger age people to vote?
There is actually, which I was surprised to learn. I didn't know that until this year. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think there's like, it's in the double digits of states that allow, I think it's like, I want to say 20, but I apologize, I don't have that number off the top of my head. But there are a number of states who allow some degree of this. So maybe they allow 17-year-olds to vote in, again, if they're going to turn 18 by the general election, there's that version, or maybe they allow them to vote in certain state elections, but not others. But yeah, there are many. California would not be a first in this respect.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I've never heard of that before. Right,
yeah, it's a new one to me too.
Okay, cool. I think that was the only question we had for that one.
Okay, we're getting to Prop 19. This is a beast. So a little complicated. This is like I'm always calling this one the Frankenstein's monster proposition, because it's sort of these three very complicated, sort of related policies that have just been kind of grafted onto one another in a way that's kind of hard to understand. But it's very much like this is how the political sausage gets made kind of proposition. So the three things that it would do, I'll go through them quickly and then I'll explain them in detail. One, it would provide a tax break for older homeowners like empty nesters, baby boomers, and some other homeowners when they want to move, making it cheaper for them to move. Two, it would provide a tax hike for people who inherit properties from their parents, mostly their wealthy parents. Again, some exceptions there. And three, it would provide a funding increase for fighting wildfire. So the first component, the tax break. So this is this is definitely the main component. It would allow homeowners over the age of 55, homeowners who are permanently disabled, and homeowners who are the victims of natural disaster to move and not have to pay a much higher property tax as a result. So again, going back to Prop 13 from 1978, because it always goes back to Prop 13, you pay property taxes based on how much you paid when you purchased your home. So if you are, let's say, an older couple and you own a home that you were lucky enough to purchase in California in 1980 for $200,000, and now your kids are out and they want to, you want to move to like a smaller condo downtown, and it's $700,000. If you were to sell your property and buy the new one, you would have to pay a property tax that is no longer indexed to your $200,000 home, but indexed to that new $700,000 home. So you basically have to pay a much higher property tax. And so for years, lots of homeowners, but particularly the California realtors, who are the people who help you buy and sell homes if you're the type of person who's buying and selling homes, they've been arguing that this basically traps older homeowners in their homes, when it would just be better for everyone if they could clear out of their big homes and make room for newer, younger families who could use that space. And so they've been pushing for this tax break. Again, it's not out of the kindness of their heart. They are in the business of buying and selling homes. So obviously they have some interest in this. But they've been pushing for this tax break for homeowners, particularly baby boomers, for years. And in fact, if this idea sounds kind of familiar, it's because back in 2018, there was a ballot measure that would have done this. And it failed by like a very large amount. It's a 20-point loss. And the reason it failed by so much is because it would have cost cities and schools, who are the beneficiaries of property tax revenue, $1 billion to $2 billion every year. And so the teachers hated it, and the teachers are fairly powerful. Local governments hated it, and local governments are fairly powerful. The Democratic Party hated it, and the Democratic Party was very powerful, so they just killed it. And so this year, the realtors have kind of come back, and they've learned their lesson, and so they've sweetened the deal. So they're adding this tax break, but they're going to pay for it by adding the second part, which is a tax hike. And they're increasing taxes on a group of people that are generally not super politically popular, which are rich kids. So the second part of Prop 19 is a tax increase on people who inherit homes. So under current law, if you inherit a home from your parents or your grandparents, this is thanks to some other propositions that were passed back in the 80s, you get to keep what the property tax assessment that they were paying. So in other words, if your new home, hasn't been reassessed since 1979 and you inherited it, you could keep just paying that assessment based on that 1979 value. So if Prop 19 passes, you could only be allowed to keep that tax assessment if you use the home as your primary residence, and even then only on the first additional $1 million in value that the home has appreciated. So, even if you do plan on inheriting a home from your parents, unless it's like a mansion, you're probably safe from this protection, from this property tax increase. But there was an article in the Los Angeles Times like 2 years ago that talked about exactly this issue, which was it showed that some very wealthy Californians, including the actor Jeff Bridges, was paying these 1970s era taxes on these properties that they inherited from their parents and then used as rental properties. And so this would get rid of that tax break. And sometimes you hear the tax break referred to as the Lebowski loophole because Jeff Bridges was in the Big Lebowski. So anyway, so those are the two parts. So you have the tax break for old people who want to move. You have the tax hike on Jeff Bridges and people like him. And then the third component was that any additional revenue raised between the tax hike and the tax break, which is estimated to be about $1 billion a year, would go to state funds to support wildfire fighting. And I think at the time that this was put on the ballot, the entire state wasn't on fire. So that's like, in retrospect, a pretty savvy move on the part of the realtors to include that. But so that I'm sorry, this is so complicated. I didn't write it. It's not my fault. But the summary here is you have this long time goal of the realtors, which gets mashed together with these two other policies to win over groups like the firefighters and to quell opposition from groups like the teachers and unions and local governments and liberal political groups who kind of tanked their effort at this policy in 2018. And just as a matter of political strategy, that seems to have worked in the sense that the firefighters union is all on board because they're going to get a ton of money from it. You also have liberal unions like the nurses union, they are supporting it. Democratic Party supports it. And even the teachers who really hated the last version, they're actually neutral on it, which is pretty good if you're a realtor. And very little opposition. You have some anti-tax groups who are not into it because it is net positive in terms of it would raise more money than it saves taxpayers, but overall it's a pretty lopsided measure. So that is the beast that is Prop 19. Any questions? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, there's one question. 1 second. How do I see?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, you got it? Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
Sorry, I think you said this when I stepped away for a second, but are there any exemptions to the, I guess, the tax hike part of it? Like
inheritance?
Yeah, is there some kind of value exemption, like only?
Yeah,
value?
there is. So sort of two components. So if you are using the home as your primary residence, so if you inherit it from your parents or grandparents and you'd move in and you don't use it as a rental property, you are exempt on the first $1 million in additional value that has between the assessed value and the market value. So if the home was purchased for $200,000 in 1979 and is now worth 1.3 million, then you have to pay an additional assessment on the increment of $100,000, but you'd be able to keep the assessment up until that point.
Okay.
It's a little complicated, but yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Awesome. We have one more question from Caitlin. Yeah, did that work?
Hi, hopefully you can. Sorry. Okay, great. Thanks, Ben, for sharing your insights on this one.
Sure.
As you said, that it's definitely a Frankenstein of multiple populations. I'm curious your thoughts on if this doesn't pass, do you think that some of these issues, such as support for wildfire victims, will be taken up directly by the legislature?
That's a really good question, and it's made more complicated by the fact that the state is facing a pretty large deficit going into next year. on the other hand, this year has been unprecedentedly horrible in terms of fire. So I'd kind of be surprised if the legislature didn't provide more aid to victims of wildfire, because they kind of kicked the ball in that last year. On the other hand, I'd also be kind of surprised if they were able to find too much money to do that. So we're all, I mean, I feel like reporters sort of fall into the trap of just saying unprecedented over and over again in 2020, but I don't know. It's a good question. Probably a lot of it depends also on how much stimulus, if any, comes out of Washington. But again, just given how horrible wildfire was this year, I would be surprised if there wasn't some kind of action. But I guess another distinction is that this would be a ongoing and permanent source of funding, whereas if the legislature were to act on this, it probably, well, it might just be a one-off. But yeah, honestly, your guess is as good as mine.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. So I think you're good to go for the next one.
Okay. We're halfway done. It's amazing. Okay, so Prop 20. It's a bit of a grab bag. So it takes a number of different issues sort of at once. So it would make it easier to consider for prosecutors to charge certain property crimes as felonies rather than as misdemeanors, which they are now. It would reduce the number of inmates who qualify for early release from prison by expanding the number of offenses that would disqualify them from being able to apply for early release. It would boost penalties for people who violate the terms of their parole. And it would require law enforcement to collect DNA samples from people convicted of certain misdemeanors like serial shoplifting. So the general theme, as you can probably tell, is that it's all, I guess, California has kind of experienced a sea change in how criminal justice policy is done over the last decade. So that there's been this sort of last 10 years of making systems as a whole less punitive, knocking some felonies down to misdemeanors, making it easier for some prison inmates to qualify for early release. And you can think of Prop 20 as kind of a response or a backlash to all of that to a certain extent. So I think it kind of speaks to how much the political conversation around criminal justice has shifted over the last few decades in California. Because again, like if you go back to the 90s, this was the tough on crime state. This was the home of 3 strikes. And so now we have this campaign, Prop 20, which is very much sort of in that mold, although not as severe as the 3 strikes, obviously. And the Yes campaign is pretty small, and the No campaign is really big. So you have on the Yes side some sheriff's groups. You have some conservative and Republican activists, like Congressman Devin Nunes has contributed quite a lot of money. You have a bunch of grocery chains, because their Prop 20 makes a lot of the laws that it sort of makes tightens up penalties for relate to shoplifting, and so a lot of grocery chains are, I guess, want to see tighter penalties for shoplifting. But at the moment, the No side is outspending the Yes side by quite a lot. And then on the No side, you have the governor, the Democratic Party, a bunch of powerful unions, including the probation officers union, who are generally not a bunch of liberal softies. And then Jerry Brown, the former governor, has dumped a bunch of his old campaign cash into this No campaign, because if you think back to his legacy, or his the last time he was governor, the most recent 2 terms, Prop 47, Prop 57 both passed while he was governor. These were measures that sort of kicked some felonies down to misdemeanors, that made it easier for people to qualify for early release. And so to the extent that Prop 20 sort of would undo that aspect of his legacy, he's decided he doesn't want to see that happen. So he's pumped a bunch of money into the No campaign and released some ads against it. So that is Prop 20.
Awesome. Do we have any questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, yeah, you're good, Ben.
All right, keeping on. So Prop 21, this is the rent control measure. So under California law, there is a freeze on any new rent control ordinances across the state, and that's been the case since 1995. So that doesn't mean that rent control is illegal in California. If you live in Berkeley, you and are a renter, you presumably benefit from rent control, or you might anyway. But cities have not been able to introduce new rent controls or new laws regulating how much landlords can charge tenants or expand existing ones since then. And they haven't been able to apply any of those rules to newer construction. So what Prop 21 would do is to do away with that ban with some modifications. So I think it's worth stressing, this is not a statewide rent control policy in the sense that if it passes, it's not like rent control is going to go into effect immediately in most places, but cities would have the ability to apply new rent control to their to homes. There are some restrictions. So if Prop 21 passes, cities still couldn't apply rent control to homes that are at least any newer than 15 years old. So it would exempt new properties or new construction. And that's sort of an important caveat from the perspective of the people who wrote this measure, because a lot of the argument against rent control, against this measure in particular, against rent control in general, is that it inhibits supply. It disincentivizes the new production of housing because people who produce homes aren't going to be able to recoup the costs of that investment. If they are, as soon as it goes in the market, they're forced to charge very low rents. And so that's why they included that 15-year-old sort of phase in for this. There's also an exemption for single family homes that are owned by a landlord who owns one or two properties. So kind of the small landlord exemption, excuse me. If this sounds familiar, it's sort of another deja vu one, which is that in 2018, Californians voted on Prop 10, which would have introduced a similar measure without that 15-year exemption, and it failed by 20 points pretty miserably. So the backers of the initiative are now back and hoping that with a few tweaks and with maybe a more receptive electorate, now that it's a presidential year, that they'll have a little bit more luck. And so the big backers here are a group called the AIDS Healthcare Foundation and its president named Michael Weinstein. And if you follow housing policy at all in California, he's like, I guess depending on your perspective, either like a progressive hero or a total gadfly who's like constantly mucking things up in the legislature. But he basically single-handedly is funding the yes side. But it's also backed by the California Democratic Party. It's also got the endorsement of Bernie Sanders. So a lot of progressive groups are behind it, the Nurses Association, a lot of anti-gentrification and tenant rights groups are behind it. And the opponents are sort of a mix of groups who either you'd expect them to oppose it because they would be directly harmed by it financially. So the Apartments Association, which is basically the landlord lobby for California, Chamber of Commerce, a lot of building trades unions, like people who build housing, because there's a concern that it will discourage new production. And then you also have opposition from sort of a more from politicians who worry that despite that 15-year exemption, it's maybe not enough, and that right now the state should just be focusing as much as it can on producing more and more housing of any kind. And so you have Governor Gavin Newsom, who actually opposes it for that reason, sort of breaking with his progressive base on most. He tends to be somewhat consistent on other issues, but he also kind of argues that the state legislature passed a sort of a loose version of rent control. Was that last year? I think that was last year. What is time? And so the Democrats don't need to, or the state doesn't need to return to this. So that's Prop 21. Any questions on that
one? Not that I see. Any questions, you all? Nope. Okay, cool. Yeah, we could go to the next one.
Okay.
The big one.
This is the big one.
Yeah.
It's definitely the most expensive one. It's Prop 22. So this is about the gig economy, quote unquote, and whether companies like Uber and Lyft and Instacart and DoorDash should be required to classify their drivers and delivery people as employees, or whether they can continue to classify them as independent contractors, which is what they do now. So Prop 22 is a response to a bill that the state legislature passed last year called Assembly Bill 5, or AB 5, which is a bill that actually codified a Supreme Court ruling. But anyway, it makes it much more difficult for companies like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and blah, 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 to categorize their workers as independent contractors. And the bill it kind of had a broad impact on lots of industries, but it was very much aimed at these companies because the entire business model of those companies sort of depends on treating their drivers and delivery people as independent contractors. And those companies will say that that's actually, you know, a good thing, that they are just an app that happens to sort of coordinate the demands of customers with these independent business owners. And they argue that it affords flexibility to the drivers who can just sort of log in, log off whenever they want and don't have to have set hours, and kind of, it's sort of the gig economy model, is just kind of picking up a gig when you need the money or when you have the time. The drafters and supporters of this bill that passed in the legislature, AB 5, said, well, actually the gig economy, these companies are sort of abusing the independent contractor classification just so that they can get out of providing things like minimum wage or overtime or workers' compensation or any of the protections that come with formal employment or actual employment, and that drivers should be afforded those protections. So AB 5 passed. State regulators immediately began pursuing these gig economy companies in court for not abiding by the state law. These companies kept claiming that they were not actually subject to the law. There's these legal disputes are ongoing. There was some talk of maybe finding a legislative compromise that never really came to pass. And so these companies are now turning towards sort of the Hail Mary of options in California, which is to go put their policy on the ballot and get voters to help them out. So if Prop 22 passes, AB 5 bill would still apply generally to the economy, to industries in the economy, but it would make an exception or an exemption for companies like Uber and Lyft. And the definition they use is just looking, it's app-based rideshare and delivery platforms. So it's very specifically targeted to these businesses. It would add some labor requirements. So there would be a minimum pay stipend for driving time. But again, just driving time. So if you're sitting around waiting for what do you call it? Or a ride hail? If you're sitting around waiting, you wouldn't get paid time. And there would also be sort of a health insurance stipend. So Prop 22 in some ways would create this new, almost a new designation, sort of like an independent contractor plus. Opponents say it's obviously not enough. And I think, supporters like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, and if you have a phone or a mailbox or a TV or have been outside in the world over the last few months, you've probably seen ads from them because they are spending an unbelievable amount of money on these ads. But they argue that if this were to go, if Prop 22 fails and AB 5, they are subject to AB 5, they're either going to have to reduce the number of drivers by something like 75%. They're going to have to double the fares, or maybe they'll just leave California entirely. It's hard to know whether that's a bluff or not because this is all kind of unprecedented territory. But what's clear is that it's a very important fight for them because they have spent about $200 million backing Prop 22, which I know these numbers kind of lose perspective on what this actually means. There's a lot of money in California politics, but that's just for perspective, about 30% of all the money that's been spent on either side of any proposition this year. So just 30% is just on that one yes side of that one campaign is coming from yes on 22, which is again mostly Uber and Lyft, and then Instacart. And opposition money is mostly coming from organized labor, so SEIU, the Teamsters, but there's also been sort of like high profile. It's just become a very sort of contentious issue that's gotten sort of national recognition. So Bernie Sanders and also Kamala Harris and also Joe Biden, they're all against it. Gavin Newsom Gavin Newsom has remained, he has not said anything about it. He sort of took a position on most of the major propositions, but he was silent on that one, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, that's Prop 22. Jack again.
Okay, yeah, we have a question. 1 second. Yeah, if you can unmute yourself, Jack, are you able to do that? Oh. Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
So I was wondering if you knew of any, so like if you knew of any kind of study or anything about the impact this might have on kind of the broader Uber in the nation. I mean, I assume Uber or Lyft or whatever, I'm sure they all say that, you know, if this passes, it might hurt their ability to operate even farther beyond California. But I was wondering if you knew of any kind of evidence around that.
No, I mean, it's all kind of conditional on how they respond. And again, we know what they say they're going to do, which is either some combination of raising fares, limiting the number of drivers, or leaving entirely. It's really unclear what's actually going to happen, because again, this is sort of unique terrain. There's no, they're not AB5s in other statewide, at least. There is sort of a national proposal for an AB5, but it's stuck in the House. So it's a good question. I mean, honestly, this is such an opaque industry in a lot of ways that there are a lot of questions that we might think we would like to have. My colleague Lauren Hepler, I would encourage you to check out her reporting on this, because she's the economy reporter at Cal Matters, and she's done a lot of good work on this, where it's like even just trying to find out like what is the average pay for a gig driver. And you know, there are studies that are sort of backed by the union groups that oppose Prop 22, and they'll say the average pay, once you factor in all the costs, is like $5 an hour. And then you'll look at sort of the more sort of industry favored studies, and they'll say it's actually $30 an hour. So we have no idea. So, I mean, even just like the basic questions that you might want to ask, which is like, would this actually help the drivers, which is the whole point, right? Well, kind of, if they're making $5 an hour right now, then yeah, minimum wage would probably be pretty helpful. And if they're making 25 or 30, then like, well, I don't know. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty around this one. Unfortunately, just such a new industry, and because they're independent contractors, it's not regulated in the way that would otherwise generate the kind of data that we'd all like to have. So.
Right. And then another thing I was wondering, I mean, this isn't really related to the effect of the law, but I just found it funny that like all the kind of discourse around it is like, should we force these gig economy or these apps to treat employees as or to treat them as employees, but like it's not really about should we force them to do something, it's should we give them an exemption. And I was wondering, is that do you think that was like any kind of conservative any kind of effort to like turn the discourse in that direction, or is that just kind of something that naturally came up? Because I think that kind of could have added some confusion.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I'm sure there's about $20 million of effort to shape the discourse on one side, and and 20 million on the other side too. So no, it's a good point. I mean, the framing of that is important, I think, just in terms of like what current law is. And I guess just because right now there is this ongoing court battle about whether AB5 does actually apply to these companies or not, and they continue to say it doesn't for reasons that are a little BS, to be honest. But yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, we have another question from Sisan. I think. Sorry if I said that wrong.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Ben.
Hey.
So I'm just curious if there are any, and I'm sorry if you already touched on this, but I'm curious if there are any studies or pieces that touched upon what actual drivers or employees think about this, and maybe, you know, what proportion are for it or against it, and if people are wanting this to pass or not, that are actually working for these companies as independent contractors.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice to know what the drivers actually want? Unfortunately not. Again, I'd point you to the coverage that my colleague Lauren has done, Lauren Hepler. There's not been any reliable surveys of these drivers. Again, just because it's such a new industry, there's not really the data available. And obviously, I mean, Uber and Lyft have their list of drivers, but they're not making that available to pollsters. And even then, I think Lauren's point, I want to summarize her correctly, but I think her observation was basically it kind of depends on what type of driver you are. If you're the type of driver who really is just sort of like a gig worker in the truest sense, where it's like you have another job, or maybe you're not working, or you're a student or something, but it'd be nice to pick up like, I'm free, on a Tuesday night, I'll just go out and drive and pick up an hour or two there. Then you're probably going to you probably like the status quo in the sense that like that flexibility is quite nice and having a little bit of extra money is nice. Whereas if you were actually treating this as like a part-time job or a full-time job where you're dependent on that revenue for like your living, then I would imagine that then you would maybe the flexibility is less important, and just having a minimum wage and some basic security and stability would be preferable. But we just don't know how many drivers fall into one category or the other, and even then, if we did, it's like, well, who do you think of as more important in that? That's just kind of a judgment call. So, but yeah, unfortunately, there's not a ton of polling of drivers in particular.
Awesome, thank you, Ben. Okay, I think that was the last question. So we can move on to 23.
All right, 3 more to go. So Prop 23. This is actually kind of, in some ways, it's somewhat similar to Prop 22 in the sense that it is another sort of industry labor dispute. So there are a lot of repeat issues on this year's ballot, and this is another one. The question here is whether dialysis clinics should have at least one physician on site during all treatment hours, and whether they should also have to report patient infection data to California health regulators. And if you're wondering why California voters are being asked to make somewhat narrow determinations about how dialysis clinics should be regulated, you're not alone. But I think the best way to understand it is just sort of a labor dispute. So you have 2 companies, DaVita and Fresenius Medical Care, and they own and operate about 2/3 of the dialysis clinics in the state. On the other side, you have unions, the SEIU, United Healthcare Workers, which has been trying to unionize nurses at dialysis clinics and technicians for many years. And over the last few years, they have sponsored legislation to impose new restrictions on these companies. Again, it's sort of a repeat issue. In 2018, they sponsored a ballot measure to cap the profits of these clinics, which at the time was seemed unbelievably expensive. The 2 clinics spent $111 million to defeat that. And now Uber and Lyft have, of course, blown that out of the water with $200 million. But anyway, and so all of these sort of legislative attempts and initiatives by the union, they've all failed, but they have succeeded in forcing these companies to spend a lot of money, which is arguably the point. So, the supporters in the union will say these are massive corporations, they're for profit, they have these huge market shares, and they need to be much more strictly regulated to make sure that the Californians who use their services, they're about 80,000 Californians who use dialysis clinics, to make sure that they are getting the best care possible. But I think it's also fair to say that the union is using this initiative as sort of as leverage, as they have in prior campaigns as well, to sort of bring these companies to the bargaining table to talk about unionization. Of course, if you talk to the union, they'll say, look, improving standard of care and unionizing the workers, those are not mutually exclusive goals. But obviously, if you talk to dialysis clinics, they'll just say, look, this is extortion. Nurses are already on site all the time at dialysis clinics. Dialysis is not a super high risk procedure, so this is totally medically unnecessary and solely about putting pressure on us. And yeah, that's Prop 23. Any questions on that one?
Yeah, we have one coming in. Camille, feel free to ask your question.
Hi. Sorry, I think you might have said this, but could you clarify? So what does a vote for yes mean, and what does no mean on this prop?
Right. So if you vote yes, it would require dialysis clinics in the state to have at least one doctor on site during all treatment hours. And it would also make some changes about requiring more infection reporting to the state health regulators. And if you vote no, nothing changes.
Okay, I think we're good for the next prop.
Okay. Oh boy. Okay, this is another complicated one. This is Prop 24. This is a measure about data privacy. So, little history. In 2018, there's a guy named Alistair McTaggart, and he is a San Francisco real estate developer. And he supposedly was at a dinner party with a Google engineer, and the Google engineer was talking to him about how much Google knows about everyone, and it totally freaked him out. And he had a lot of money. He decided that large tech companies were just gathering way too much data about consumers, and so he lobbied the legislature effectively to pass a bill to do something about it. The tech industry lobbied back, and the compromise that they all came up with was called the California Consumer Privacy Act, which gives consumers the right to find out about what kind of data is being collected about them. It allows them to opt out in certain cases, at least opt out of having companies sell their data. And so at least on paper, the California Privacy Act, which is the law, the California Consumer Privacy Act, excuse me, it's the strongest privacy law in the country, one of the strongest privacy laws in the world. In practice, it's a little more complicated, partly because the regulations it's a very complicated law, and the regulations on the act are only now just going into effect, or as of June, they were just going into effect. So there's still kind of a lot of people are figuring out exactly how far it goes, how it's being enforced, that kind of thing. But in any case, the real estate developer, Alistair McTaggart, he now feels that the law really didn't go far enough. It sort of, in the legislative process, it was sort of corrupted. It was watered down too much. And so he's decided to put this new measure on the ballot called Prop 24, and he describes it as a way of strengthening the Privacy Act. It's a very long proposition. I think it's about 60 pages. So a lot of people still kind of arguing about what it would actually do. But the big changes include making it harder for companies to share data, not just sell it, because right now a criticism of sort of a loophole is that you can tell companies, okay, don't sell my data, but they can still share it without, even if they don't have a consumer's consent. It would also increase penalties for violators. It would provide more funding for the state to actually enforce the terms of the act. And in terms of funding, McTaggart's basically the only person who's funding it. He's single-handedly funding it, but it has gotten some somewhat high-profile endorsers like Andrew Yang, the former presidential candidate, Congressman Ro Khanna, who's sort of a very progressive congressman from Silicon Valley, some consumer groups. And they argue, again, the existing law just doesn't go far enough. It had too many loopholes, doesn't have sharp enough teeth. And also, if voters pass it this way, then it would be harder for tech companies to come in and sort of lobby it down and weaken it down again, because once it's put on the ballot, voters get to vote for it. What's really interesting about this measure is that you might expect, okay, it's a privacy measure, so it's going to have consumer rights groups on one side against big tech companies. But in fact, big tech companies, for whatever reason, I don't quite know the answer, are pretty silent on it. And it's become this fight between consumer groups and privacy advocates against other consumer groups and privacy advocates. And so you have groups like the ACLU or the League of Women Voters or the Consumer Federation of California, and they're all opposed, which is a little disorienting. And they make a few different arguments. So one is this law is just way too complicated. Again, it's like 60 pages. No one actually knows what it does. And basically one rich guy just wrote it. And so it would be better to have sort of a more deliberative process, even if it does maybe get, if the risk of putting it through the legislature is that it does get watered down. At the very least, you have more than like one person's eyeballs on it. There's also sort of a privacy argument, which is that in some ways, Prop 24 includes components that might actually weaken privacy law. According to the argument, it would allow companies to charge consumers more if they demand not to have their data collected. And so there's that sort of opposition to it. And then the other thing is just that the Privacy Act is still very new. This is, again, another argument that opponents make. It's really just it's still being worked out. The regulation has only just been enacted. So maybe let's wait to see how that goes before sort of rewriting it entirely. And I think, this is all very complicated. And I think what speaks to how complicated it is just that the biggest voices on this, some of the biggest voices in California politically didn't take an issue, didn't sort of take a position. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a big sort of big name in sort of tech policy, they're neutral. The California Nurses Association, which is a big progressive group, they're neutral. The California Democratic Party didn't know how to decide, so they're neutral. The California GOP is opposed. Not entirely sure why, but they are. But anyway, so it's really complicated, but that's the short version. Are there any questions about Prop 24? I hope I can answer them, but again, it's a tricky one.
Yeah, we have one question.
Sure.
Go for it, Jack.
Yeah, so this one I was confused about. But so I'm looking at Ballotpedia official arguments, and in the official arguments against it, it talks about like this would approve an internet pay for privacy scheme where people could, or where companies could, I guess, slow down connections. Or I'm not really sure where exactly that could be coming in. Do you, is that?
Yeah, so that is one of the arguments that you hear from sort of the, like the ACLU will make that argument, which is that it includes some provisions that would allow companies to charge consumers more if they demand not to have their data collected. So again, the California Consumer Privacy Act does allow you to say, hey, Google, I see you're collecting this information about it. Don't collect it on me anymore. And this provision in Prop 24 would apparently allow Google to say, okay, well, I guess Google's a bad example because I guess Google's not going to be charging you, but some other Amazon say, maybe they'll charge you a surtax or something like that. Again, I'm not sure if that translates into like throttling your speed, because I'm not sure if it applies to like ISOs. And again, there's a lot of uncertainty about how any of this would actually work. And I don't think I'm just projecting because I'm confused, but I think that is generally an uncontroversial thing to say, which is it's a very long measure. A lot of sort of the argument that you'll hear from the no side, the yes side will say, well, no, it doesn't. And it's just hard to know. Although I think on that particular measure, the yes side does concede that there is that provision in order to sort of win over the neutrality of the Googles of the world, so they wouldn't just dump a gajillion dollars against it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that was the only question. Okay, so
Hey, last one.
that's prop.
Okay.
Great job, Ben, by the way.
Thank you. So the last one. Okay, so the question on Prop 25 is, do you want to abolish cash bail in California and replace it with a standardized risk assessment system that would allow judges to basically decide whether someone should go free before their day in court? And this is actually another kind of confusing one in the sense that you actually have progressive groups who are on both sides of it. So the background here is that in 2018, the state legislature actually passed this law. They passed a bill called SB 10 that would ban the use of cash bail in California. Again, so someone gets arrested, and while they await trial, a judge this is bail, it might give them an opportunity to sort of pay the court by posting collateral for the right to await trial to be free while they wait for their time in court. So the bill in 2018 scrapped that system entirely and replaced it one in which judges basically have the ultimate authority to decide whether someone is free to go before trial or not, and they just make a determination based on not how much they can pay, but sort of whether they are deemed to pose a threat to themselves or to others, or whether they pose a flight risk. And the law also required judges to implement, or counties to implement, sort of statistical risk assessment systems that would categorize defendants into low, medium, or high risk. And ultimately, the law says judges have the ultimate authority. They don't have to listen to these systems, but it would provide them some analysis that they can draw on. Most California counties actually have a kind of a recommendation system like this in place, but the law would require it in every county, and it would be used to inform pretrial detention decisions in general, not where bail should be set. So basically, the money, the law takes money out of the equation and replaces it with a sort of judicial discretion, or sort of a tech-assisted judicial discretion. So if the legislature already passed it, why are we voting on it? So as soon as the law passed, the California bail bond industry, which is the people who loan money to people who want to be able to make bail but don't have the money on hand, they mounted what's called a referendum campaign. And under California's constitution, a referendum is a ballot measure that says, okay, the legislature passed this law, but we're not really sure about it, so we're going to let the voters decide. So if you vote yes on Prop 25, you're saying, great law, let's get rid of cash bail and replace it with this new system. And if you vote no, you're saying, let's keep the old system. So supporters of Prop 25 say cash bail penalizes poor people. It creates a sort of a two-tiered system of justice for those who have money and those who don't. It also coerces people without money into accepting plea deals, maybe guilty pleas, even if they're innocent or even if they could fight the case effectively because they can't afford to pay bail or go into debt. And also another argument is that there are only two countries in the world that have cash bail. It's the US and Philippines. So we're definitely like the outlier in that respect. And these arguments really picked up a lot of the momentum, in the last year, especially just with the sort of the renewed focus on criminal justice reform and racial inequities in the criminal justice system. And so you do have a pretty deep bench of endorsers, the governor, California Democratic Party, SEIU, leaders of a bunch of unions, pretty much every major newspaper editorial group, the leaders of the state Senate and the Assembly. The opposition, it kind of comes in two flavors. So one is sort of the more predictable one, which is the bail bonds folks. They're the ones who put it on the ballot. They're pouring a ton of money to oppose it because if it passes, their industry goes away, and so they don't like that, obviously. But there's sort of another more complicated argument that you hear, which comes from groups like the ACLU and the Human Rights Watch. And their arguments are cash bail is bad, but what this bill or what this measure would replace it with is arguably worse, in the sense that judges would have virtually infinite discretion to make these decisions. A lot of judges are elected, so they might be under political pressure to be as punitive as possible. And also that because they would be relying on these risk assessment systems, which are sort of based on statistical models that are based on sort of prior offense behavior and prior criminal behavior, that it would that would help to bake in the sort of racial inequality even further into the system. I guess one sort of counterpoint to that is that last year, the state legislature did pass a sort of a follow-up law that said any of these statistical systems that counties introduce have to be evaluated on a regular basis for racial bias. And so supporters of Prop 25 will say, like, yeah, that's a potential issue, but the systems, the flaws in the system can be sort of remedied, and there are safeguards in place. So that's Prop 25.
Thanks, Ben. Any questions on that prop? No. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think that was the last prop, right?
That was it. That was all 12.
Good job, Ben. Yeah, folks. Do folks have any questions in general about all the other props, or? No. Okay, I don't see any hands being raised. So yeah, that's great job, Ben. Thank you so much.
Sure. I will share the voter guide in the chat if I can't.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, there's no chat. Okay. Well, anyway, it's calmatters.org.
Yeah, we're going to send out the voter guide, which is a great guide, as well as we're recording this. So feel free to share the recording. The voter guide's amazing. We'll be sending it to all participants. Thank you so much, Ben. That was really great.
Is the voter guide on CalMatters, Ben?
It's on CalMatters. It should be on the homepage. You can also go to calmatters.org/election-2020-guide, but it should be on the homepage.
Yeah, there's like great 1-minute videos on there.
Yeah, so if you're looking for you see this video and you're like, oh yeah, I should watch that recording. It's an hour and a half. Maybe I'll just take the 1-minute version. And it's also got a little quiz that you can take if you're not sure how you feel about different props. It'll help you make a decision. So.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
I'm not sure. This might be a question.
Yeah.
Camille, is that a question?
I think they're just.
Oh no, sorry, I was just thumbs upping.
Okay. No, first, just want to make sure. Thank you so much. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Stasi, do we stay on or?
Recording. Oh, and then you can stop at the live.
Yeah, I'll stop the live. Bye, everybody.
Bye.